Okay, all right. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to another episode of Table Talk, a series of conversations with activists and academics who work and think about animals and humans. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Harris, and my co-host Anu Pandey is also here. The Indian Animal Studies Collective aims to bring together academics and writers who are working on human animal relations in India. Today, we have with us Richard Twine, and we are going to discuss his new book, The Climate Crisis and Other Animals. The talk is going to be recorded and it'll be available on our channel and on Spotify and on our website. It's a very informal discussion, so feel free to contribute, to ask a question at any time. The talk is only for 1 hour, so it'll go by really quickly. So thanks, Richard, for being here. And I thought we could jump straight to the book and talk about, the main topic as it is. One of the main arguments you make is that the climate crisis is connected deeply with a crisis in human-animal relations. And those of us working on human-animal relations, I know that some of us think this is correct intuitively, but no one's really theorized much about it. So could you tell us a bit more about this argument?
Of course, I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
And I'll begin by thanking you for the invitation and also thanking you for the work that you have been doing with your collective. I've seen many of your posters for all your previous talks. Um, so yeah, I thought there was in writing this book here, I thought there was definitely a gap in terms of books on the climate crisis, in terms of trying to give a proper space for thinking about the connection between human-animal relations and the climate crisis. There hadn't really been a book, especially a sociological book, which did that. So in terms of thinking about the intertwining of the climate crisis and what I argue is a crisis in human-animal relations, I argue that they both share a sort of they share an ideological underpinning, and that is the ideology of anthropocentrism. And so this is not simply the kind of common sense definition of that term, the kind of literal understanding of that word as human-centeredness. I use the much broader definition, which is typical within critical animal studies and associated with people like the philosopher Matthew Calarco. And this is seen as a broad ideology, anthropocentrism as a broad ideology that assumes a sharp binary of human-animal difference. And it also assumes human supremacy as well. And it also includes the application of those assumptions to the dehumanization and animalization of many groups of humans. And is also an ideology that tends to pervade the major institutions of society. And it's developed in tandem with the evolution of capitalism and patriarchy and colonialism. So we know that human-animal relations are in crisis because we have entered a sixth mass extinction event. And we also know that the scale of the agricultural animal industrial complex generates all sorts of risks to life generally, humans included. We know that that feeds into the climate crisis via emissions and the land use transformations associated with animal agriculture that degrade carbon sinks and also are linked to also then are linked to higher levels of emissions. And we note how the climate crisis now becomes a major contribution to the extinction risks of non-human animals, alongside other things like hunting and over commercialization and so on. So this would be my basic sort of initial answer to that question. Yeah.
Um, and I feel like when this connection is occasionally made at all, the connection is made as, the impact of climate change is that it affects biodiversity too. whereas you're saying it's constitutive of the climate change crisis itself, right?
Yeah.
And why do you think, why do you think this connection is overlooked? I know that you say, you make a case for anthropocentrism and you theorize about that and you talk about how it's not just human-centeredness, but it's much more. But why do you think this connection escapes everyone? Is it just because animals are just generally marginalized?
Mm. I think I think it's complex, but if we think about well, if we think about global North nations, for example, we all tend to be quite sort of meat cultures and meat-based economies, and not just the global North, because even that distinction between global North and global South is not particularly helpful here, because if we think about the meat industry of Brazil, for example, or if we think about the dairy industry of India, it's not just simplistically North and South, but we do have very entrenched cultures and economies based around the consumption of animal source foods. And so it's thoroughly normalized. It's done so in a quite essentialist way. So it's almost like to be human is to consume other animals, this kind of ideology. At the same time, though, the violence associated with animal source food consumption is contradictory for the self-identity of the average consumer, we might say. So it's kind of psychologically problematic. And I would say this creates like a social taboo in which talking about the subject and the sort of spaces associated with it, such as the slaughterhouse, can take on an awkwardness for many people. So firstly, people and institutions tend to shy away from critically thinking about this. They enjoy the consumption, but they don't want to think about the production. And secondly, the idea that there could be a connection between animal source food consumption and environmental problems is something people find hard to engage with, partly because of this taboo dimension. In the same way that they might not want to talk about how their cheap clothes are manufactured in the global South, and maybe that relationship also is exploitative too. So this is very much the kind of Marxist take, which would be people would rather fetishize their commodities without examining the relationships behind these commodities. And so that's very protective. Commodity fetishism plus social taboo is very sort of effective in terms of shutting down critical thinking about this. And furthermore, so in my book, I outline, following others as well, how the media, especially the right-wing media, has tended not to focus on the link between animal agriculture and climate change, and also how some academic disciplines have until recently shunned it as well. So it's a problem with how academic disciplines have been constituted also. I think it illustrates how a taboo can be really quite culturally pervasive. Let me give you a quick example from the UK, but I think one that will resonate with many listeners. So one of our most famous and respected broadcasters is David Attenborough, and obviously known for his wildlife documentaries, which made on the BBC, but I think exported around the world. And it took him a long time. In fact, it was only last year, 2023, that at the end of his series, Planet Earth 3, that he belatedly began to support transition to a plant-based food system, or at least a reduction in animal source food kind of consumption. So that just shows that, the pace of change is quite slow, and it's quite political as well. Like the media gatekeeps the sorts of things that can be said. And even if things are quite evidence-based, it doesn't mean that they necessarily end up being spoken about in a widespread manner. So I think those sorts of ideas form the basis of my explanation as to why the link has sort of existed in this space of soft denial, we might say.
Yeah, I know. Go ahead.
Sorry, my Zoom was updated and I can't find the raise hand thing, so I did it the old-fashioned way. But thanks, Richard. I was also interested in asking, but Susan's just asked that, this sort of pitting of climate activists against animal rights activists, and this kind of incomprehension that the goals are basically the same, the interests are the same, and not, one at the cost of the other. And another
Mm,
field in which I find that this sort of pitting of one against the other happens is, um, in our case, in the case of India, the whole idea that interest for the rights of animals or the welfare of animals should not be at the cost of identity assertion or ways of lives of communities that are typically marginalized, let's say in the case of the caste system, so that
mm,
refusal to consume animal products is seen as a higher caste Brahminical sort of way of life, and
mm,
that being propagated or popularized as the imposition of what is, and right now with the right wing in power, of course, seen as the dominant narrative being imposed upon communities who do not want to in a sense, rightfully so, let themselves be subsumed into an identity that is not theirs, or to be outlawed because of their food practices or ways of life. I
mm,
recently did a talk for the Cultural Studies department of my own university. And
mm,
while I had suspected that they would be largely still in the humanist tradition, I had not expected the sheer scope at which non-human animals are invisible for them. And that turned out to be the case. And a lot of the questions that emanated after the conversation were precisely on lines of this, that taking an interest in animals is a narrative that comes from the right, let's say, and that marginalizes the ways of life or the ways of being of communities that are not a part of the, so to speak, uppermost castes. And there again, what I was trying to do was to sort of suggest that these are not interests that are one versus the other, but that a certain question of solidarity should emerge because these are victims of a systemic oppression and a systemic marginalization, which has a more than human dimension. So I'm wondering how sure you find these questions and accusations as well in your work. How do
mhm.
you do this? How do you convince people or try to convince people that these interests are not different, distinct, one at the cost of the other, but rather part of a bigger problem?
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. One thing that I certainly do in that area is to advocate for an intersectional approach to the to understanding the climate crisis, and so trying to work out those issues and power relations and how human animal relations intersect with class relations and with gender relations and with racialized relations. And what you just described there about the Indian caste system isn't really that different to the British social class system either. So it's the right wing media will represent calls for eating less meat as some kind of like liberal middle class policy being forced upon the average working people. And so it's a similar narrative being repeated, I think. Um, so I mean, I think I mean, just as a slight tangent, I mean, I also do consider the kind of liberatory potential of the healthiness of a whole food plant-based diet briefly in the book as well. So I think there's a way in which plant-based transition is a kind of can be seen as a kind of working class or liberation for the poor because it's a way of kind of contesting the way in which capitalism feeds um, cheap, low quality food to the to the masses. But yeah, I mean, there's various other things that I would say about that, I guess, and it would be um, so let's think about the idea that I think we'll come back to a bit later, which is the notion of the capitalist, which I think we're going to talk about that later. This distinction that I talk about a lot in the early part of the book between the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene. And so that's also quite crucial to thinking about these issues as well, because I think the Capitalocene idea, although some people associated with it probably don't like the idea of intersectionality, but I think it's in that kind of similar intellectual space. So I think it's trying to be attentive to the intersection of different relations of power. And so the capitalist idea, which we'll come back to, I think, a bit later, is importantly, it's attentive to the historical and contemporary role of colonialism in the climate crisis. And there's a sub-literature there on the racial or racialized capitalist. And so capitalism, as I understand it, has attempted to export the idea of meat cultures around the world. And so that has involved this kind of the global diet has been meatified and dairyfied. It's I view this as an aspect of colonialism. So what is often referred to as the globalization of the standard American diet. So actually, this kind of viewing a kind of plant-based transition as some kind of middle-class imposition doesn't really fit, because the real imposition that has been going on has been the diet centered in animal sourced foods. At the same time, I think we also have to say that although that's a kind of standard American diet, this very very meaty animal source food centered diet is but Western centered. That doesn't mean to say that there are not long-standing traditions in many countries of animal source food consumption as well. Okay, so but they're not typically on the same scale as we've seen with this kind of Americanized, globalized meat-centered diet. So I think we need to open up a few different conversations there, and to sort of avoid the sense in which calls for a plant-based transition to a plant-based diet just end up sounding like a new form of colonialism. So I think it's sort of up to every culture to reflect upon its own food culture and how international relations are shaping its food culture. Interestingly, some countries embrace the influence of international food corporations, and other cultures try to sort of stop the influence. Think about France historically has tried to block the sort of influence of things like McDonald's and that kind of thing. And it's up to every culture, especially in the context of the climate crisis and the nature crisis, and the international community, I would add, to reflect upon ideas of what constitutes a sustainable diet. So thinking about the environmental consequences of its particular food culture and of the global food system. And so it's also up to every culture to reflect upon the relationship between its food culture and public health as well. That goes back to what I was saying earlier about health. But then we need to make that extra step, I argue, which is a far less anthropocentric step. So last but not least, it should be the responsibility of everyone to think about reflect upon her knowledge around the difference of non-human animals, including scientific knowledge about the unique subjective lives of non-human animals, how that has implications for human-animal relations, including whether or not particular animals are defined as edible and unkillable. And obviously we know there are differences, cultural differences there, and religious differences. And I think, and maybe this, I'm not a religious person, so I don't foreground sort of religious rites in my thinking. But if a religion has a particular taboo around eating animals, that's sociologically and anthropologically interesting. If it has a particular norm for consuming a certain animal, then or particular practices which are justified on religious grounds, I think I would take the view that that scientific knowledge should supersede that. Um, and I'd want to say, yeah, I don't, for example, think that an alternative global plant-based food system needn't necessarily be seen in sort of neo-colonial terms. It would depend on many things, how it was organized and how it came into being. Um, and one argument I make towards the end of my book is that we shouldn't just be sort of striving for a decommodification of human-animal relations. We should ideally be joining with a kind of food justice argument for a decommodified food system as well. So that would be a food system which could potentially carry both the fight for the right to food, food justice for humans, but also justice for non-human animals to not be seen as edible and killable. Okay. Also to add, I guess, this wouldn't be one criticism that might also be made, and it relates directly to your question, I think, in terms of just as a globalized American style diet it could be seen as like suppressing cultural diversity and identity. You could make a similar argument, and some people make a similar argument against an alternative notion of a globalized plant-based diet. But I think that's not necessarily the case. There are many different styles of plant-based eating which could support cultural diversity and identity in this kind of vision of an alternative global food system. But I think internationally, and it's interesting at the moment because we've obviously got the COP29 meeting going on at the moment. If anybody's listening to this later, we're mid-November 2024. And I think in the context of those sorts of meetings, there's actually a place for poorer countries of the world, or poorer countries of the world, to put pressure on richer countries to transition to a plant-based food system. So that just like there's an argument that rich countries should decarbonize first and fastest, you could make the similar argument that richer countries should transition first and fastest to either a plant-based or at least a plant-rich food system. So I think that would be an entirely just argument made by countries of the world who are especially experiencing the brunt of the climate crisis in terms of heat waves and other extreme weather events and that kind of thing. So, I mean, your question is a really good one, and it's a complex one. Hopefully I've given you some bits and pieces which could be part of an answer to that, but I don't necessarily claim to have all the answers to that particular question.
No, no, absolutely. It was very helpful. Thank you.
To just follow up with that, I thought that was really interesting that you foreground critical animal study of the book. We've had lots of different speakers speaking on the connections between capitalism, colonialism, and exploitative human-animal relations. But, sometimes, scholars don't want to foreground that this kind of also
How do you mean? Do you mean in the sense of bringing in critical animal scholarship to
yeah,
yeah
because if you're describing something sociologically, you could talk about what is happening, highlight the connections, say this is what's happening, but not really foreground the ethics or say explicitly that it is the animals who are who are suffering, who are equal participants in the society, not make all these conclusions or
sure
just leave them hanging in the background. But because you bring in critical animal studies, these conclusions are explicit in your book. So why did you make that intervention? Why is critical animal studies important for your arguments?
Yeah, thank you. I think part of the answer to that question is maybe a difference in emphasis in terms of how people do sociology, because I guess you can have a type of sociology which is a little bit sort of distanced and is a little bit just more descriptive. Um, but I'm very much would place myself within the tradition of sociology, which is advocating for the oppressed and is concerned with ideas of social justice and so on. If you think about the emergence of sociology through Marxist critique and other forms of critique since then and so on. So I think it was crucial to bring in critical animal scholarship for several reasons. One reason would be that the work that I was finding interesting in terms of historicizing the climate crisis, such as the work on the capitalist scene, it needed a bit more. So for example, the work of Jason Moore, the US environmental historian, it is quite good in terms of thinking about multi-species relations. So he's well aware of the problem of anthropocentrism, but his work isn't particularly advocating for animals. And I felt that it needed like a stronger it needed like some help, really. So that's why I thought, let's bring some critical animal scholarship into the theoretical work on the idea of the capitalist scene. And so that was certainly one reason. But then I think I also probably have at the in the heart of my thinking around critical animal studies is a kind of residual humanistic idea that the liberation of animals also serves the liberation of humans as well. So it's not I guess because my background's also in things like ecofeminism, that's what I did my PhD on in the late 90s. And that tradition is very much in terms of trying to think about the interconnections between different oppressions and so on, and how, we can we need to think about human animal relations in order to kind of think about gender relations, and we need to kind of understand the intersections and overlaps between all these different relations of power in order to kind of have a proper, we can't improve the position radically of non-human animals without engaging with the question of capitalism. We can't do it without engaging with the question of patriarchy. And we also can't do it very well without engaging with questions of colonialism as well, and race. So yeah, that's been my sort of that. I guess that gives you like a better explanation of where I'm coming from in terms of my background and the sort of type of sociology that I practice, and why that would then influence why I feel the need to bring in that critical animal scholarship into large parts of the book. I mean, in the second half of the book is quite focused on the issue of transition and how that happens. So that is sort of another kind of sociological focus, like to ask the question, how does social change happen? How does social transformation happen? How does change happen? And to break that up and to try to come up with some potential ideas for how we can, progress towards a better situation. We're obviously not in a good place at the moment. Recent political changes, such as in the US, do not help things at all. The fight against the climate crisis just got a lot harder. It was already hard, but with Trump's re-election, it just gets so much harder. Yeah. And we have a political climate around the world where, in many countries, it's kind of a reassertion of kind of conventionally hard masculine leaders coming to power, and kind of quite right wing. And yeah, I don't think that helps any sort of progressive cause. So yeah, it's very unfortunate that people are electing these sorts of people. But maybe I'm going a little bit off topic now.
Um, could you tell us a bit about, I thought it was really interesting in the introduction when you talk about why the Capitalocene is a much better framework than the Anthropocene, and you discuss how the Anthropocene is useful, but the Capitalocene brings all these ideas together. And I feel like that, that's the kind of concept that you find useful again and again. Uh, the kind of framework where you don't have to exclude anything, where you don't have to keep out the differences among humans or inequalities among humans to think about or to think with non-humans. But why is this connection important? Other than that, the capitalist framework promotes exploitation of animals.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so I guess it's the most theoretical part of the book in the first couple of chapters where I engage with those ideas. And the problem is that, well, the Anthropocene idea essentially emanates from natural scientists, not social scientists or philosophers. And so their expertise is in things like geology, and it's not in a broader conception of historical change. In fact, geologists often don't even reflect upon how political the history of geology is. If you think about how extractivism and fossil fuels is so tied to geology. Um, anyway, we have this in the academy, we have this sort of quite incredibly deferential situation when social scientists and humanities scholars uncritically use the Anthropocene concept. It sort of makes me a bit sad. You don't you don't need to be deferential to the natural scientists when we're interested to try to historicize the climate crisis. Surely it should be social historians, economic historians, sociologists who would be the experts on this topic. So in the book, I join thinkers like I've already mentioned Jason Moore as one, Andreas Malm is another, Donna Haraway is another well-known example, but many others as well in critiquing the Anthropocene idea. The Anthropocene idea is failed to offer any theoretical account of the emergence of the climate crisis. And that's not what it was designed to do. It's not, they don't have the tools, the people that came up with the idea. So it just gives us this undifferentiated notion that humanity has become responsible for a new epoch. Okay, so that's all very sort of exciting, and it lends itself to magazine front page headlines and this kind of thing. But it has nothing to say about capitalism. It has nothing to say about the causes of, how did we get to this situation of the climate crisis? And for me, I think that's paramount that we need to know that. So I find the Capitalocene concept more convincing precisely because it understands capitalism not only as an economic system, actually, but also as a social, cultural, political mode of organization, which is not separate to nature. It reproduces nature according to its own central ethos, which is capital accumulation. So Capitalocene is also intended to be an anti-dualistic idea as well. So we're not thinking about humanity changing nature. We're thinking about humanity as always being part of nature and entangled with nature. We are nature. And our economic system of organization, which also shapes culture and society and politics, this is also continually reproducing what we have come to call in the English language anyway, nature. So the Capitalocene gives us a way to think about how social class relations, gender relations, colonialist relations, and human-animal relations are important to both the development of capitalism, but also the development of what we're calling the Capitalocene as a better term for the era in which we are now living. So, for example, yeah, under capitalism, animal labor is a kind of cheap labor, which on its own, historically, has been expropriated as an almost on an unthinkable scale um, for the accumulation of capital. And so it's also been important, and this is where the kind of theorizing gets a bit more interesting, is that to go back to your question, it's not just about the fact that under capitalism, animal labor has been exploited. That's kind of an obviousness. But it's also been important in terms of thinking about other relationships as well. So it's been important for thinking about social class relations, because mass-produced animal source foods have also been used to provide cheap, low quality food for the working class. Why is it important to have cheap, low quality food for the working class? It means you don't have to pay them high wages. And it also means that they stay healthy enough to work, but not too healthy to thrive and flourish, right? And then also we could do the same thing and talk about gender relations as well. So the links between the way in which animal consumption also performs masculinity and that kind of thing, which is lots of people have written about. And then, yeah, so like the work of people like Dinesh Wadderwell, who I know you've had on before, he gives us a detailed analysis of the relationship between non-human animals and capitalism. And so that's really important, intricate work that he does. And I think most people would accept that animal exploitation is not necessarily specific to capitalism, but under capitalism, the uses of animals become specific in certain ways. They become multiplied and they become intensified, especially as we move into the 20th century. And so really any account of human-animal relations or animal rights has to engage with how the ascendancy of capitalism over the last 500 years and the way in which its globalization intensified in the 20th century both had decisive consequences for human-animal relations. This is why I also get a little bit annoyed by philosophers who talk about animal rights but don't talk about capitalism. So I think, I have lots of problems with lots of different disciplines, I guess. So yeah, it's had decisive consequences for human-animal relations, which I now argue are seriously in crisis. I think that's, empirically quite easy to justify as true. But what I do with the Capitalocene concept in chapter 2 of my book is to try to further improve its theorization, its understanding of the importance of how the capitalist production of human-animal relations over the last few hundred years have had a significant contribution to the overlapping climate and biodiversity crises. And so I'm essentially bringing critical animal scholarship, as I was saying before, and Capitalocene scholarship closer together, because there is still this kind of residual anthropocentrism in some of the leading scholars of the Capitalocene who don't necessarily advocate for things like veganism or things like that. So I'm taking the idea of the Capitalocene because I like a lot about it, but then I'm adding my own twist to it in terms of bringing critical animal work within it, and then also spending some time in chapter 2 thinking about the relationship between meat consumption and social class, meat consumption and colonialism, and meat consumption and gender, and just trying to strengthen the Capitalocene idea, really, in terms of its understanding of human-animal relations. Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about, because in multi-species ethnography, for example, or just in multi-species anthropology, there is a lot of emphasis on learning from scientists and on interdisciplinarity. And that kind of interdisciplinarity is slightly different from what you do in this book. Even though you draw on scientists and you cite Crutzen and Stormer and so on. But I was just thinking about how, when you draw on these scientists, often when you're trying to make the connections between climate change and its effect on animals, you can only conclude and say something about the extinction crisis or biodiversity, but not so much about the lived experiences of animals today, um, or how social systems today are affecting animals. So I thought the chapter on meat cultures, it pricing, but it's of course very important and central to the theoretical intervention you're making. So could you just talk a bit about it, about why it's not enough to just rely on science or the scientific understanding of animals, but also on a social understanding of human-animal relations?
Mm.
And would you consider that as an ethical point you're making, or is it again simply a sociological one?
Which one? Which point?
That it's not just scientific, but that the effects are social, and socially these things are happening to animals, right? Like the meat cultures, for example, which is often not, it does not figure in anthropologists' arguments, is not seen as central to them, but it is central to you. But is
Mhm.
that an ethical point you're making, or is it to you simply a sociological one? Not
Mm.
simply in the sense of reductively simply, but purely simply.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think with anthropologists, again, they're dealing with the particular tradition in their discipline, which is quite what we would maybe call positivist, where they they might reject that, but they obviously have a tradition, don't they, within anthropology, not to make what would be seen as kind of judgments about cultures and this kind of thing, and to kind of have this sort of distance reaction or distanced approach, I guess. And that sometimes feeds into the work on multi-species ethnography, which I think is what you're getting at. Um, yeah, I think this we're just dealing with slightly different traditions. So in sociology, at least and there are different sociologies around the world too, different traditions within my discipline. But yeah, just being a descriptive sociologist doesn't, for me, kind of maintain a kind of faithfulness with the core of what I see sociologists doing, which is not just describing the world, but also contributing to civic civil society and critical thinking debates, and trying to this is what my book is doing, is obviously it's giving my perspective, but it's also trying to contribute to critical thinking debates around these important subjects. And so yeah, I'm making sociological points, I'm making ethical points, and those ethical points tend to be based upon um or are inseparable from some types of scientific knowledge, such as ethology and our knowledge about the capacities and agencies of non-human animals. But I also take your point that that knowledge isn't necessarily just scientifically derived. It's derived also from everyday life. And so if you live with a companion animal, you have your own knowledge of that animal, and that feeds into um your thinking about the value and of your relationship with that animal and so on. And so that's really a nice kind of sociological contribution in terms of thinking about how everyday knowledge, um, not just expert knowledge, so-called expert knowledge, is valuable here. Um, so I would just, yeah, in chapter 3 of my book, I am trying to kind of go beneath the just talking about the extinction threats and actually going into detail around all the different ways in which the climate crisis is already affecting non-human animals in their everyday lives. And yes, the knowledge that I'm drawing upon there is mostly from conservation biologists and that kind of thing. But I think you're right. There's possibly a gap there in what I've done. And you could also try to have another chapter which included types of knowledge from other places. And that could be knowledge from farmers, for example, who might be witnessing how climate change is impacting the animals that they farm, whether or not we agree with that practice. It may be from knowledge from people that live with animals in some other way. It might be that, in this country, for example, one of the impacts of the climate crisis is that dogs and cats are being more susceptible to like ticks and diseases from ticks and this kind of thing because the climate is warming and it's making it a better environment for these small insects which can pass on, which hook on to dogs and cats and this kind of thing. So yeah, you would have the experiential knowledge that you could tap into from lots of different people, and it doesn't just need to be the conservation biologists, although I'm quite happy that I've given them a voice in that third chapter because I think they've been researching this for decades. And some people still deny climate change. Some people think it's something that's going to happen in 20 years. What chapter 3 makes clear is that millions of animals are already dying from climate change, right? And many thousands of human animals, if you like, human animals, human beings are already dying from climate change. And so that's like a really important point to make, which is made in that chapter. But yeah, no, I thank you for making that point because I think that would be another way of thinking about it in terms of thinking about the everyday impacts of climate change, but maybe drawing upon other sources of knowledge. So yeah, this may be a nice project for the future. Yeah.
I see that Ashok wants to ask you a question. Ashok, are you there?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Let me introduce myself. I am Ashok Haldar. I am from Bangladesh. I am an undergraduate student at Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman Science and Technology University, which is located Gopalganj. I really thrilled I really thrilled to participate this kind of open talk and thanks Richard Twine for his special and thank to you all for the discussion. And I have not read the book yet, but I want to share my one of my experience about human-centric world. Uh, how we became a human-centric world? Why we cannot become a part of Earth? My question to research that what is the major cause for being a human-centric world, and can we solve the world's food crisis without eating meat?
Was that a question at the end? How do we
Yeah,
did you
can we solve the world's food crisis without eating meat?
hmm. I think that's what we should try to aim for, but it also depends. It's a complicated question with a complicated answer because there might be different answers to that question in different parts of the world in terms of the quality of a plant-based diet in particular parts of the world might vary. Um, if you walk into a supermarket here in
Yeah.
in England, it's full of vegan options and plant-based milks and plant-based meats. And so even though it's still a minority practice here, it's actually very easy to accomplish. And yeah, I fully understand that infrastructure hasn't developed to the same extent all throughout the world. But then there are, countries have different traditions around plant-based eating as well, don't they? So I think I started off answering one of my questions to say that, you know, almost every country in the global north is a very meat culture. And then and some global south countries are as well, like Brazil and Argentina and so on. But then many countries also have their own sort of histories of plant-based eating, and obviously this is so relevant for talking to the Indian Animal Studies Collective, because if you compare the consumption of meat between India per person with the US, it's so much lower. And if the whole world ate the same level of meat as India, then we would, we'd potentially have a much more sustainable food system, right? So, India could make the case, and I'm not sure, I can't speak to Bangladesh, but I imagine that the level of meat consumption in Bangladesh is not as high as in my country and so on. So yeah, that's I think why I said, like, in one of my answers as well, that your countries should be making the case to countries like my own that you have things to teach us, because our food systems are the ones that have particular problems, and we probably it's ours that need to be problematized first. Yeah, so we have the problem that we need to make that transition faster first. But in terms of thinking about, like a proper transition away, not just from a meat-centered food system, but a transition away from anthropocentric ideology, then yeah, there's as I said in another one of my answers, that every society should go through that process of reflection around um, how they regard other animals, and whether actually, whether there are good grounds, ethical grounds, not for consuming other animals. So yeah, it's I'm glad you're looking at that in your work, and yeah, it's a complicated question with a complicated answer.
Did you want to add something?
I wanted to ask a question, but I have a dog climbing on my shoulder, so this is not the best moment, but we'll try to make it happen. Richard, I was really interested in something that figures at the very beginning of your book, at the very beginning of your introduction as well, something that I found fascinating, very rich, very helpful as well. And I'd like you to maybe talk to us a little more about that. And that is how you move away from the sort of, too simplistic way of thinking in terms of cause and effect, and you propose emergencies and effects instead. And
Mm.
I have a sense of how you mean this, but it would be really kind if you would just go into this a little in detail.
Yeah, that is a point that I make sort of early on. Like, there's there's a big discussion, isn't there, about, what are the sectors of economies that have caused the climate crisis? And clearly fossil fuels are major. Fossil fuels are perhaps the biggest cause of the climate crisis in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. Um, but in reality, what we can't do very well is separate out all these sectors. So the food system is enmeshed within the energy system, and the energy system and the food system are also enmeshed within the transport system, right? So all these different sectors of um, economic um, expansion are all, you can't neatly separate them out. And so to say that um, the energy system causes this, or meat consumption causes this, it might make us say things which are like too simplistic. So if we talk about the emergences of climate crisis as a kind of interrelated um, set of infrastructures in a increasingly global economy, um, intensely globalizing throughout the 20th century, then maybe we can have a better sense of how things have come about, rather than just um, simplistically talking about how one particular sector might be the cause when these things are all very much entangled with each other. And so maybe my language of emergences rather than causes is a better one. I don't know. It's still something that I'm grappling with, but I thought I just wanted to sort of try and avoid the simplistic language of cause and effect, because you can't isolate those sectors and those practices. Yeah. So I guess it's like a bit of a, when you start writing a book, there's all sorts of sort of ontological questions you need to try to settle. You also need to say things about the language. In animal studies, you have to say something about the language, especially, it depends on what language you're writing in. But when you're writing in English, there are some words in English which homogenize animals and you want to avoid. So instead of talking about cows or cattle, I don't use the word cattle. I use the word cattle ungulates, and I don't use the word fish. I use the word fishes. So there are all these sort of things you have to do at the start of a book, which are about your ontological position and your use of language, and demonstrating that you've been reflective to these things and trying to kind of, and the same thing like trying to be anti-dualistic as well, which is obviously a big theme of the book. So yeah, I think there's another question, so I'll stop talking.
Anisha, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for a great discussion so far. And Richard, I really look forward to reading your book. I haven't had the opportunity yet, but it's been in my reading list for a while. Actually, my question kind of goes with what you were just talking about, in the language of the book. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the use of terms like more than human and other than human, and why you choose to use certain terminology over this, and how that kind of feeds into approaches within different disciplines that you were speaking about earlier. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Anisha. It's a good question. And I think it's an ongoing question for the field. So where I find use with the phrase more than human is when I want to say that I'm not just talking about non-human animals, because I don't want to falsely abstract non-human animals from their ecologies, and I don't want to neglect a discussion of plants, So sometimes it's important to use that term, I think. I do use the term non-human animals quite a lot because that's because for me, even though it can be quite clumsy, for me, I always want to sort of imply to my reader that I view human beings as animals, because that's an important anti-dualistic kind of move for me. And I do tend to agree with, like, Darwin's theory of evolution and so on. So yeah, those are two of the main ones. I mean, thinking about my chapter 3, when I'm talking about the impacts of climate change on different non-human animal species, I summarize that at the end of the chapter. So I have this table at the end of the chapter where on the left-hand side, I've got impacts, things like wildfires, droughts, rising temperatures, floods, changing body size, things like this, all these different impacts that climate change is happening. Then on the right-hand side of the table, I've got example species. So I just put a few examples. What are the species that are being impacted by these changes? And in some of the entries, I also include humans. So I'm including humans as an example, because I don't want to separate out my summary of the impacts of climate change on humans on the one hand versus animals on the other, because I want to convey that this is, we're suffering a shared fate. So I'm sure you all saw coverage of the floods in Spain recently, and they're happening in other countries too. We had we had the man from Bangladesh before. Bangladesh is a country very susceptible to flooding and sea level rise and this kind of thing. So there's a shared impact, isn't there? And so maybe this is also another source of solidarity between humans and other animals, because there's a shared impact, and we both we all all forms of life have an interest in protecting what we have, and in, you know, fighting those people and groups who are trying to stop change, and to yeah, who are trying to still even deny climate change, which is incredible. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha.
And with that, it's an hour. Thanks a lot, Richard, for spending this time with us and for patiently answering our questions. You've given us a lot to think about. The book is great, and the chapters do the central argument justice. Congratulations on the book, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.